Thank you, Dr. Chappell. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. It's the first time I've spoken in a public setting at Wheaton College since I had my speech class my sophomore year in 1985. So thanks for coming. It's great to see so many of you that I know from the Black Hills context and some other contexts. And I know it's a really busy time of year for everybody, so thanks again. Come and hear me share a little bit about myself, a little bit about public health, about environmental health, and a little bit about Ethiopia. So just to give you an idea where we're going to go, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me to give you a context. If you are looking at health professions, what kind of people go into this part of health professions. So I'll talk a little about me, give you a context. We'll talk about public health in general. When I was here at Wheaton, I was in the biology department. And it seemed like everybody except for me and two others were pre-health professions. And Wheaton is just famous and well-known and well-respected for their pre-health professions programs. And I heard a little bit, but maybe not much, and maybe you hear a lot more about it nowadays, about public health. But I'll just say a few things about public health. Here comes all my friends from geology. Hi, guys. All my Black Hills friends. We'll talk about what environmental health is in the context of public health. Talk a bit about Ethiopia in general, environmental health issues in Ethiopia. Then I'll talk about two specific projects that I've been involved in, just to give you a flavor for the kinds of things that environmental health gets involved in. And then I'll just have some final reflections. And be happy to take any questions after that if you guys have any. So to get started, I was born in South Jersey and spent lots of time growing up at the Jersey Shore, and it's nothing like the show. I've never seen the show, but I've heard about the show. I can tell you that it's nothing like that. I really started following Christ my junior year in high school, and when I started getting serious about my faith, people in my church said, oh, if you're serious about your faith, you have to be a pastor. Well, I was going to be an engineer. It's like, no, you have to be a pastor. It's like, oh, okay, I'll be a pastor. So off I went to Wheaton College to become a pastor. And remember, I've been following Christ for about a year and a half at that point, and I learned all sorts of new words like evangelical and Arminianism and Calvinism, and I was like, wow. And it's very new and very exciting. And another exciting thing was I found out that, hey, you can be a scientist and be a Christian. If you're serious about Christ, you do not have to be just a pastor. So I ended up being at Wheaton College, graduated in 87. I ended up being a biology major on a dare. One of my floor mates was complaining about how hard College Bio 1 was, and I said, it can't be that hard. He says, yeah, well, you take it. So I did, and ended up sticking with it. I remember I was on Fisher 3 East for 2 years. My second year, remember there's this kind of goofy but really smart, really nice guy who was a freshman that year. His dad was a professor in the English department. So I got to know Phil Riken pretty well that year. And then I spent 2 years in Mac 3 back when it was a boys' dorm. It's weird to me knowing that it's not anymore. After I graduated, did some work with the Army, and then I started working in Chicago for a while at a national toxicology program research lab where we were evaluating the toxicology of various chemicals. And while I was there, I was taking some part-time classes, and I got approached by a professor kind of recruiting me into a program in environmental health. And I said, I haven't got money for grad school. And they said, well, you don't understand, we'll pay you. I was like, oh, where do I sign? So that's an advantage of environmental health is it often costs you nothing to get trained in it. And so off I went to University of Illinois at Chicago. Had no intention of being a professor or a PhD. God just kept opening a series of doors, one door after another. And I ended up at Bowling Green State University in Ohio in an environmental health program where I teach undergraduates 95% of the time, teach various aspects of environmental health. I do things with exposure assessment, environmental statistics, and a lot of air quality issues. So that's a bit about me. And I'm involved in this field called public health. And public health is a little different. It's kind of the other spectrum from clinical practice in that you're really not treating individuals, but your patient is the population. You're trying to preserve the population's health, and it's a preventative aspect of that health, in that you're trying to prevent illness rather than curing illness. So it's different than clinical health in a couple ways, in that it's preventative and not curative, and it's population-based versus individual-based. Some of the core disciplines of public health, there's lots of room for lots of kind of actors and characters and players in public health, but the core areas are epidemiology, which deals with the determinants, deterrence, and distribution of disease. There's biostatistics that crunches the numbers for that, typically. Lots of room for good mathematicians in public health. Public health administration, which is a very unique animal. Some people think it's similar to, say, healthcare administration, but because it's population and preventative based, it's not like running a hospital in very many significant ways. There's public health education and behavioral science aspects of public health. Education is a really important part of the preventative aspects of healthcare. And then the last core discipline, which is the one that I'm involved in, is environmental health. And if you happen to want more information on public health, there's the Association of Schools of Public Health have a very good informative website, whatispublichealth.org. That's pretty easy to remember. So that's public health in general, and my specific area of public health is environmental health. And environmental health is very multidisciplinary, and it really deals with the interface between humans and human activities, and what we do to and put into the environment, and then what's coming back out of the environment due to that, and natural causes to impact human health. So if we think in general of what causes illness, well, illness is caused by things like genetics, behaviors, which is addressed by the public health education aspects of public health practice, but also environmental exposures, things that are out there that get in here to make us unwell, or at least increase the risks that we face. So we're dealing with a variety of different kinds of environmental agents that can impact human health, which include biological agents, germs, bacteria, viruses, different parasites. They move around and they can enter the body. Chemical agents, various kinds that can produce acute illnesses. They can produce delayed effects like cancers. I've been involved recently in a lot of chemical effects for neonatal exposures of women and the effects that occur in their children. And physical agents. Physical agents, by definition, is anything that can deposit energy into the body. So that broad area can be noise, temperature extremes, ionizing radiation, electromagnetic fields. Those sorts of things are environmental agents. And environmental health deals with all these environmental agents getting into human bodies and being exposed to the human exposures, and human populations being exposed, and the risks or health effects that may come from them. And these things move around, again, to give you, that's what the things that make us, that can be in the environment to make individuals ill. They can travel through water. They can travel through the air. They can be in food. And then other kind of combined environmental health areas, other than water quality, air quality, food safety, include occupational health and safety, which is an area that I have specific emphasis in. The occupational environment is an environment that people spend at least a third of their life in, but it's not sexy like waterfalls and dolphins and rainforests, but it's where people are, and it's where environmental exposures to chemicals and biological agents and physical agents occur, and risk is very high in those areas. There's public health sanitation, waste management, both municipal waste as well as hazardous waste. Chemical wastes are a big issue for environmental health, particularly in the two-thirds worlds where it's very poorly managed. And vector control is also an important area because of transmission of a variety of diseases and housing quality. So all these are just big picture overviews of some of the things and some of the areas of environmental health. And again, the goal is to limit, control, understand environmental exposures like these in order to protect populations' health, preventing them from having illness or injury rather than being at the curative side. So that said, I'm going to give you a little bit of overview and introduction to Ethiopia, where I've been spending a fair amount of time for about the past 7 or so years. It's my interaction with Ethiopia is an interesting one. I was going to say remember back, but you guys wouldn't remember back in 1984. Well, some of you would. But there was a record or song put out by Do They Know It's Christmas, called by Bob Geldof and some musicians trying to raise money for famine in Ethiopia. And then the spring of 1985, there was Band-Aid in the US, and then there was Live Aid in the summer. And I was a student here, and I remember being really moved and an awareness level increasing in me that point about what was going on in the world, about the conditions for life outside of the US, which was my context. I'd been to Mexico when I was a high school student, and that started bringing things out to me. And then my freshman year, actually, here, I was involved in tutoring a Cambodian refugee who had escaped from Cambodia. And this occurred. So it was really part of God really opening my eyes into the conditions that were around the world that were very, very different, not just very vastly different than the ones that I had experienced all my life. So Ethiopia and the response to the famine in 84 and 85 was very significant in my development of my worldview. Ethiopia, as you probably know, is by the Horn of Africa. This part here, Eritrea, used to be part of Ethiopia, but after the downfall of the communist regime in the early 90s, Eritrea became a separate country, so Ethiopia is now landlocked, which is a big problem for them in many ways. My area of particular experience is around Addis Ababa. I do a lot of work in Addis Ababa. I've been down through the Rift Valley Lakes area, and then down to the Jimma area here, and hopefully soon I'll be up in Gondar doing some work in the university up there. So my experience is by no means comprehensive, and there's a lot to love about the country, and there's a lot more that I need to know and learn to love about that country. You can see that it's got a very unique topography. We were talking about this at dinner. One of your classmates is Ethiopian. I forget, what is her name? Sige. Yeah. She joined us for dinner, and it was great talking to her. But you've got these Ethiopian highlands here, the Rift Valley, and then some more highland areas, and then don't let the green fool you. It's a altitude indicator rather than a vegetation indicator. It's a fairly, it's grassland and scrubland in most of these areas, and somewhat desert area. But it makes infrastructure and makes movement very difficult. You cannot easily get, if the ridges are running this way, you can't get across them very easily. A 20-kilometer, as the bird flies, distance between a couple of villages could be more than a day's travel. So it's some of the infrastructure challenges are part of what's connected to the public health and environmental health challenges in Ethiopia. So you've got the highlands divided by the Rift Valley, It's arid and semi-arid in the north. There's a little bit more rainfall in the south, but that's even been changing lately. And it's a seasonal monsoon. There's a brief, what they call the little rainy season in March, and then June and July and a little bit of August is rainy. The rest of the year, except for the very deep south, there's not a whole lot of water. So it's a very small window. It's a very tentative agricultural situation. And here's just some pictures of typical areas that I've been in. This is kind of at the border of some of the mountainous areas in the Rift Valley. All these are fields of teff, which is a grain that forms a staple crop in Ethiopia. This is a typical tukul house in that area. More of the rangeland. This is a dry field waiting for the small rains. This was taken in end of February, and they're waiting for the rains to come for that field to be watered. This is actually at a edge of a protected area. Most of Ethiopia is deforested. It's been occupied for such a long time that the trees there are sparse. Where this was taken, there's a forest called, there's a whole nother talk to be given about natural resources management and public parks management, wildlife management in Ethiopia. But it's just interesting in that there's a reserve called the Menegesha Forest that has been protected for about 150 years now, but that's about the only place you're going to find really dense forests in the northern part of Ethiopia. And I'll talk a little about urbanization there, but it's typical African urban environment. Lots of intermixing of nice apartments and hotels with less than adequate housing. And this shows you to point out that even though it's a city, you'll run into goat herds and hay being transported. And it's a very interesting environment. Ethiopia is very ethnically and linguistically diverse. The new constitution that was developed in the mid-90s reset the provinces based on ethnic lines, which in some ways is good, in some ways bad. But these actually kind of represent a lot of the ethnic groups, the Oromos, the Amhara, Tigray, Afar, Somali. This area here is a group of dozens of different small peoples groups. But it is ethnically and linguistically diverse. The prominent ethnic groups are the Amhara and the Oromo. The Tigray are a small ethnic group, but they're politically in power now. And there's over a dozen, there's about 70 or so different ethnic and linguistic groups that are there. Interestingly, when I work there, it's nice that the language of higher education is English. So it makes it quite easy to interact there. And I mentioned earlier to some people I was talking to that if you're walking through a university, you stop in a classroom and look inside, and there's going to be an Ethiopian professor speaking English very badly to the whole group. But the reason he's doing that is because the group includes people who speak Oromo, Tigrina, Amhara, and a variety of other languages, but they all speak English badly. So that's the way they can communicate and get education. It's a very long history. It goes back 1,000 years. Modern Ethiopia has been around since late 19th century, put together. Diverse kingdoms were assembled by King Menelik II. Religion, Ethiopian Orthodoxy as independent Christian church was founded in the first millennia, and it really puts a certain flavor into the national character, and we were talking about this at dinner as well, that Christianity as a cultural tradition is old and is indigenous to Ethiopia. Ethiopia was never colonized. It was occupied briefly by Italy, but it was never colonized, and Christianity was never introduced by a colonial power. They always had Ethiopian Orthodoxy, and that gives a certain flavor and certain characteristics to that culture that are very unique for Africa. There's also a large proportion of the population that is Muslim too. The Oromo and the Afar and Somali are Muslim. So it's, depending on if you're believing the government count or other counts, it's approximately 50% Ethiopian Orthodox, about 45% Ethiopian Orthodox, about 35% Muslim, and then there's some Protestants and indigenous religions as well. It's fairly unique in that it's still primarily a rural population. It's about 83% still rural. The urban areas are growing, like most of the world, but still you're going to find most of the population outside of those urban areas. Ethiopia is relatively poor in natural resources. They've got lots of rocks, but there's nothing good in those rocks. It would be nice if you had some gold or silver, but it's just rocks. They do have coffee. Coffee is indigenous to Ethiopia. It's a great blessing on the world. I was actually in amen, says Dr. Greenberg. I was actually in the Jimma area, is the region there is right where coffee first came from, making some really great coffee there. I'll talk a little bit about coffee later on, but they don't have a whole lot in terms of export. About 85% of all employment is agriculture, and most of that is subsistence agriculture, although they do export some coffee, textiles, and leather. So that's a little bit about, give you a context of this place I'm talking about. What's the health status like there? And you can look out there, and there's huge sets of health status indicators that are available. One important health status indicator, maybe you know this, I didn't know it for a while, is literacy. Matter of fact, and literacy is 43%. It's increasing. It's fairly equitable between male and female. Interesting fact that the number one demographic determinant for fertility rate in women is the higher the literacy rate in women, the lower the fertility rate is. So you increase women's literacy and birth rates will drop. I've spoken to some international students about that, and they find that very interesting. Life expectancy at birth is 197th in the world at 56 years. Infant mortality rate is 7.7%, so that's under 1. Under 5 mortality rate is 11%. I mean, just try to imagine 1 out of 10 children born dying before they reach 5. That's just kind of out of our realm of conception. And the physician rate, there's about 1 physician per 30,000 people. And that ratio is increasing because there's, like a lot of the two-thirds world, there's a lot of brain drain or educated flight of the educated from those countries. They want to live in the West. And about 50% of the children under age 5 are stunted in some way. A couple other things to look at graphically. The idea of the health status there. Births attended by skilled health professionals in rural areas is 3%. Urban areas almost half. Vastly different than what we see in the U.S. Access to improved water sources. This is about the time of the changeover in government. So there's been improvement almost at least to access. I'll say a little bit about how good that access is in a few minutes. But rural areas, still less than 30%, less than 25% have access to improved water sources. And it's a very water scarce population. Ethiopia uses 15 liters per person per day compared to even other third world countries or two-thirds world countries, and much less in the US. And looking at the percentage of life years lost, 82% of them is from communicable diseases, which are environmental health risks primarily. Non-communicable is 12%, and 6% is injury. And all of these, significant portions of these are environmental health related life years lost. There are chemical exposures, but the cancer rate in Ethiopia is fairly low because they're dying at 56. The effect of environmental exposures is very high in these numbers that we see. So quickly, just a real quick review of some of the environmental challenges there. You got look at water quality, water quantity, sanitation, urban air pollution. I'll show you later a study about indoor air quality for rural females, and actually urban females as well. Food issues, waste management, and vector control. So again, fairly quickly, common view in suburban and rural areas is having a water point, common water point where people will go to fill water containers. In urban areas, there's not water to every residence. People that have faucets will sell water. And common site of hauling water. As far as sanitation, there's very little centralized collection. Matter of fact, there's no centralized collection. Urban areas still have septic systems that are occasionally pumped out, but primarily you've got open drains and sewers like these along the roads. In the nicer areas, they cover up the drains with some rocks, but it's still pretty noticeable. This is from the Ethiopian EPA itself, just describing the state of sanitation. The rivers and streams which are flowing through Addis are open sewers. Many industrial plants and production enterprises are directly discharging their effluent into the rivers and streams. Polluted waters end up in the Awash River. Little and Greater Akaki rivers are particularly burdened in heavy load of capital's municipal industrial waste. It's just it's staggering to see sometimes. Rural issues for sanitation are common solution is to use pit latrines. The bedrock is 1 foot down. It's very hard to dig pit latrines in rural areas. Air pollution is a growing issue. Lots of, they're finally phasing out leaded gasoline. Lead is an extremely hazardous substance. This is a picture of a bus stop that is early morning startup for the cross-country bus systems. Automobile haze in Addis Ababa. Waste management is an issue. It's a little bit different than the US, and the kind of recycling and reuse issues they have are different than in the US. And there's also a growing threat of hazardous chemicals. I took a picture of this dumpster here because in my 6 trips to Ethiopia, it's the only empty dumpster I ever saw. They're always overflowing, they're very rarely picked up, and probably about 1/10 of them that I see are flipped over and used for housing. It's actually pretty good housing. You know, it's dry underneath there if you flip it over. There's an open dump in Addis Ababa that's right along, this is the equivalent of being right alongside the Eisenhower Expressway. That you can see spontaneous fires start. There's hyenas there. There's whole populations. The recycling in Ethiopia is very high, but it's very informal. This is a bunch of recycled goods that the communities that live on the dumps are waiting to take and go sell. And just for talking about urban planning here, this is downtown Addis Ababa, and this is about the extent of what it was 40 years ago when the dump was sited right here. So nice far outside city limits. But you zoom in, here's the dump, and there's housing all around it now, and housing's growing in that area. So managing that waste and limiting the environmental exposures that occur from that is a challenge. Vector-borne diseases are a problem as well, from the mosquito and the tsetse fly, and schistosomiasis or snail fever. It's interesting that this is one of the programs there. It's interesting, we don't have malaria in our area anymore. Where I live in Ohio was the Great Black Swamp, and there was malaria there rampant for years and years, but it's not anymore. Why isn't malaria there anymore? Got rid of the mosquitoes. How do we get rid of the mosquitoes? DDT, right? So we don't have malaria anymore. That's great. These people don't want mosquitoes either. But what does the developed world say? Don't use DDT. Interesting, some of the dynamics there of, well, you guys use DDT and you're healthy, but you can't. That's a interesting subject that could be explored some more. And that wasn't a mosquito, that was a tsetse fly eradication program, but one of the many programs there. Food safety, there isn't refrigeration, there's not a lot of water. There's a lot of old pesticides that are around that can produce chemical exposures that are dangerous. Storage of grains is an issue, I'll mention it briefly. And then you've got desert locust, killia birds, and field rats. Desert Locust Research Institute lab trying to control desert locusts. This is a pretty quillia bird, but when you've got flocks of them, they can decimate crops in a day. This is the only silos for, remember, Ethiopia's staple crop is teff, with which they make injera. This is the only improved silos that I've ever seen in the entire country, and it's in Addis Ababa. These piles here, some of these piles are just of the straw part, but most of a lot of the piles are the grain itself just piled on the raw ground and then covered over with straw, and that's how they store it. And it's estimated 30 to 50% of it's destroyed by rats. We're doing some work on looking at and how to kill rats, chemicals. We're looking at some natural rodenticides, but it's a daunting problem. And I want to talk, moving into a couple specific projects I was involved in indoor air pollution. This is a rural Tukul and urban areas, and it's not that cold in Ethiopia. It's actually pretty great climate if you ask me. But most of the cooking is done indoors. So any indoor combustion that takes place is not for heating, but for cooking. So you can get poorly ventilated homes, and the issue is you've got women that are doing this work, and they're very highly exposed, and lots of times you have infants that are on their back or on their front being exposed to very high concentration of air pollutants. And you've got small developing lungs, it can be a significant problem. So you've got particulate matter, commonly called smoke, which can increase respiratory disease and decrease lung function in children. Epidemiology shows that exposure to particles while lungs are developing results in long-term decrements in pulmonary function. And carbon monoxide exposures are significant, producing heart symptoms and potentially fetal hypoxia. And I'll mention a little bit about that in a second. So a project we did was looking at what's called the Ethiopian coffee ceremony. Ethiopia, as I mentioned, is very ethnically and geographically and linguistically diverse. There are two things that make an Ethiopian an Ethiopian. One, they eat injera, teff, it's a staple crop. And whether you're Oromo or Afar or Gurage or Amhara or Tigray, you take coffee the same way in what's called coffee ceremony. It's done in rural households 2 or 3 times a day, sometimes less in urban households, but coffee is made for a group right in front of them. You use charcoal or agricultural residue to heat water, to roast coffee beans, to burn incense for about an hour. And it's a great time, it's a great cultural time for discussion, for talking about problems, for being together, but the smoke levels are extremely high, and the indoor air pollution is very low. So we can see here's actually a nice urban house. This is a rural house in the Jimma area. These are some urban shanty houses. This is Janelle. Some of my undergraduate students were helping me with this study. And you can see that they're, right here is an example, there's a charcoal brazier with a heating water. This is a brazier with incense on it. And they'll also be cooking coffee beans. Like here, she's roasting coffee beans over the charcoal. And that's a close-up of incense brazier. And you can see a little bit of the smoke coming off of there. So what we did was we measured carbon monoxide and respirable particles, which are small particles that get deep into the lungs, do the most damage. We measured them on the preparer and also near the participants. We took some note on the room dimensions, and we did some qualitative comments on the ventilation characteristics of the room. We talked to them about some perceptions that they had. looked at 10 homes in this pilot study. Prepare age was from a young girl up to a 50-year-old. Incense is used. It's interesting. Incense, we did follow-on work. Again, some of my students were doing some work this year trying to apportion the carbon monoxide and particle exposures, how much is due to incense, how much is due to the charcoal. It turns out incense is a pretty big contributor to the particles, but the religious reasons were both cited as a reason to use and not to use incense. So that was interesting. We need to explore that more. Most of the time is a little over an hour. Some of them just did a couple times a week. Some did it 3 times a day. A lot of them did it 2 times a day. It just gives them some idea of the room characteristics. Natural ventilation is an ordinal description of access for open doors or windows to the outside. And we asked them, are you concerned about the coffee smoke exposures during the coffee ceremony? And they're pretty evenly split from, no problems, no fear, I get worried, I don't like it. So it's evenly perceived as a problem or not. And these are some of our results. The respirable particle exposures, the U.S. has a allowable small particle exposure standard that's right about here. But that's for 24 hours. If we were to average these over the 24 hours, some of them will be less, some of them will be more, but there's still very significant exposures to particles to these women who are actually preparing the coffee. What we did was, if you look at the exposure levels, the duration and frequency of it, the WHO has stated that there is not a no effect level for small particle exposures. Any exposure to small particles is going to increase health risks. So the WHO provides what they call slope factors for that, and based on our observations, that for these, on average, the chronic cough rate for these women would increase 26%. The rate of lower respiratory symptoms would increase 24%, and the death rate would increase 6% with the ranges given there. So this is not an insignificant exposure, but is a fairly significant woman's health concern. Carbon monoxide exposures are shown here. The 1-hour World Health Organization allowed level is 25, so you can see almost all of them are above that, so these are significant carbon monoxide exposures. They're set to protect individuals with coronary artery disease, which is probably not that common in Ethiopia given their typical diet, but it is set to protect, as I mentioned before, from fetal hypoxia, and a lot of these preparers are young women that are in childbearing age, so that's a potential concern there. And then we also asked them, what are your thoughts about using alternative heating methods? And we had a great discussion at dinner about how can you fix this? What's the solution? We've got a problem. We've got significant health risk. What, in general, this shows is that the ones that are marked in green basically say, we like charcoal no matter what. Charcoal tastes better. Better taste keeps tradition, the social aspect of it. And there's some other comments here. A lot of them said, whether it's recorded here or not, that I don't have any frame of reference. I never tried anything other than charcoal. I just didn't have the option to do it. One woman, I think it was this woman here, said she used the electric stove to preheat the water before the ceremony to make it shorter. So there's some innovations there. But many times it's a young woman in the household who's just told what to do too. So their degree of choice in the matter is not very high either. So we've got this problem looked at. What are the potential solutions? That's the hard part. You can have alternative heating. You can reduce the use of incense, which we found out now. You can improve ventilation. But all of this is contingent on the cultural acceptance. This is a very important cultural practice. And I'll say a little bit more at the end of some of the challenges of you can define problems, but fixing them is another issue, and sometimes a very big issue. So So we're exploring some things and looking at the opportunity to maybe educate people, talk to some of the older people, talk to some of the Ethiopian Orthodox priests who would suggest that the incense is tied to religion. So it's still an ongoing project. Another project that I've been involved in recently is looking at Giardia and Cryptosporidium in treated water in Addis Ababa. Addis Ababa has a couple water treatment plants, but they only meet about half the demand. They've got surface water from reservoirs that use fast sand filtration, and then they chlorinate it. And there is also a well field that they just chlorinate. And then there's a delivery system that's pretty low pressure, which can be problematic if you have leaks or failures, of which there are frequent. There's not a time that I've been in Addis Ababa that there hasn't been a day or two where we just didn't have access to water. So a little about Giardia and Crypto. There's some of the top protozoan parasites, public health significance. 2.2 million people die from diarrheal diseases, a lot of them in sub-Saharan Africa. And even in areas, and Addis Ababa is one of them, even when you have improved access to water, acute diarrheal disease is not uncommon in some of these developing areas. And these are particularly problematic in immunocompromised individuals, of which Africa has a large number. So what we did is most of this work was done by a PhD student in Ethiopia. And there's 3 raw water sources, 17 storage tanks, and 17 point-of-use taps that were analyzed for Cryptosporidium and Giardia using EPA method 1623. That just looks at the number of cysts that occur, and then whether those cysts are viable or not can be done by based on the uptake of fluorogenic dyes. And we also measured physical and chemical properties of the water sample as well. See if there's any sort of determinants. What would be a determinant of some of these occurrences? This map, I'll brag a little bit, was done by my son using skills learned in Dr. Clark's class. But this is Addis Ababa, and the raw water sources, reservoir here, well field here, number of storage tanks, and then point-of-use taps. We found there's nothing uncommon. The sources were contaminated when there's surface water, and there's little contamination in the well. In the tanks, 41% had cysts or oocysts in them, but there was a low viability. So that was kind of good. At the point of use, about 20% of the point of use taps had cysts or oocysts in them, and about 6% of those were viable. And statistically, the only water quality parameter that we were able to relate statistically to the occurrence of these was the turbidity. This shows the location of red is the viable cysts, green is just presence of cysts in tap water. And then this is for Crypto, previous was for Giardia. Again, green is cysts or oocysts, and the red is viable oocysts. So what does this mean? Well, existing water plants aren't working very well. You shouldn't have, although in the water tanks you had non-viable cysts and oocysts, you shouldn't have any with properly functioning fast sand filtration. They chlorinate, which is good, and that's what is killing them, but there's something wrong with those systems. They're being asked to do more than they were designed to do, and they're very poorly maintained in general. In the distribution system, there's problems because you end up with viable cysts at point of use, and part of that is going to be due to the fact that you've got these frequent breakdowns. You've got a low pressure system, you've got a breakdown, you've got, remember those open trench sewage systems? You've got contamination, though when you've got no pressure, they're going to leak in. And they don't, when that happens around here, you'll get boil warnings for a couple days. They don't have that sort of system there. But it'll just be fixed, brought up to speed, water will go down through the distribution system, and you'll get these viable cysts at the point of using the tap. And we didn't have enough to statistically look at it, but there's a number of tap sources that had zero residual chlorine at them. Not enough positives to statistically find a relationship, but that could be a next step that we look at there. And then the solutions. How do you fix this? I'll talk about that really when I'm in this one here. A few reflections as I wrap up. What about solutions? Well, before you go forward in solving a problem, you have to spend a lot of time defining the problem. So a lot of what we're doing, what I've done, is defining the problem. But now what do you do? In the case of the indoor smoke studies, I had dinner with a Ethiopian young lady, and we really couldn't think of any easy way to deal with that. It's what Ethiopians do. Have that coffee ceremony in that way, and there's be resistant to change. We started defining the problem of parasites in the drinking water system. What do? It's easy. Just get $1 billion and improve the water system. Fortunately, $1 billion isn't easy to come by. So it's actually kind of a bit of a frustration being involved in public health and environmental health, which leads to what I call clinician envy. Because I've got friends and acquaintances who are doctors and dentists, and they can accumulate donated supplies and a couple $1,000s, and they'll go for 2 weeks overseas, and they'll come back with a list of dozens of people who they cured, made better, and improved their life. I wish I could do that sometimes. I can't. When I'm going, about half the time I'm doing teaching. So I'm developing manpower. I'm looking at the long term of what's happening and hoping that the manpower that's being developed when I do training is going to trickle down, and eventually lives are going to be saved by preventing illness. But sometimes I just like to go out there and do the appendectomy so that the person can come and say, thanks for saving my life. People don't say thanks for saving my life when you're in public health. And it raises an issue of hope. When I first went to Ethiopia in 2004, I guess was the first time I went, a couple guys from my department went along with me. We were looking for opportunities to collaborate and do research and do some training and do scholarship. And we came back, and one of the guys, great guy, like him a lot, but he said, I'm not interested in this as a project. There's no hope. We can't fix Africa. There's no way to fix it. So I'm not going to spend my time doing that. And I could see his point of view. Sometimes you look at it and it is frustrating, and you don't feel like you're going to have influence. You don't feel like there's a whole lot of hope. But as a Christian, that's really what my hope is in. To paraphrase a quote from Mother Teresa, she said that when you're doing an activity, God does not look at the efficiency of it. He looks at the amount of love that's produced in what you're doing. So it brings me to the point that I would refer to then is that even when you've got problems defined that have difficult solutions, when I envy my clinician friends, if I look objectively, I know that there's not a way that I'm going to fix the problem, or even a lot of people are going to fix the problem. But what's my calling? I happen to be called to do this. Do I know why? Because God called me to do it. It's just what I'm called to. And if I can say that I've responded to what God's called me to do in the best way that I know how, part of me still wants to see the results, but part of me says you need to rest in that you're obeying your calling. I have no idea what the ultimate responses are going to be, the ultimate outcomes, or whether there's even going to be one individual whose life is improved. I think there are, but I don't know that. So it's a matter of calling for me, and I hope as you guys look to the future and whatever you're deciding to do, that you consider calling as well. And I'd like to wrap up with the life verse for me and my wife, Maureen. And it speaks to this in whether you think you know what you're doing is effective or not. But Paul writes, "Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." And that's what I've got to look to. So when sometimes I do get frustrated that I don't know how to fix the problems. I'm following my calling, and God's promised me that my labor isn't in vain. So as I take my scientific expertise, my teaching skills, organizational skills, administrative skills, and are using them, it's not up to me to have the results. And that kind of helps me as I continue this pursuit of what God called me to. So thanks for your attention. Appreciate you coming. We have question time. If anyone has any questions, I'd love to answer them. Any questions? Yes.
So in your graph, with regard to indoor exposure to particulate matter, there was a great variation. And I wonder if all of those were following traditional practices, then perhaps there were some traditional practices or some indoor environments and characteristics of them that led to lower levels of exposure. Did you identify what those were?
Yeah, the question was about the variability that was seen in the particle exposures in the indoor air pollution study and determinants of those. And the answer is we couldn't identify any ones consistently. We know what they are. Well, we hypothesize what they are. And it would have to, and this is what actually one of my students is doing his senior work on, which is the practice in choosing how much charcoal is going into it and the ventilation in the room. We did not have the equipment or the liberty to fully characterize the ventilation in the room, so we tried to do it with these ordinal scales, saying, is there an open door to the outside? Is there an open window to the outside? Or is there an open door going to a room that has an open door? And we think there's a relationship, but the sample size was too small to find statistical significance between those. But that's what we think they are, and further work would have to confirm that. Any other questions? Yeah.
For the coffee ceremonies, you were saying that it seems that in the rural locations, they perform the coffee ceremonies more times during the week. I was just wondering if you found reasons why that was happening, and also if you tested coffee ceremony, if you did that in different locations throughout the country, or if it was just like generally about that.
Right. The question was about the coffee ceremonies, the frequency in the rural areas, and where we did where the sites were. I think in the rural areas, the reason they do it more often is just their way of life, and it's agricultural, versus in Addis Ababa, it has an unemployment rate of about 80% in the formal sector, but there's lots of other things going on, but the people who are there are laborers or professionals, and they've got different time schedules. The men aren't home at lunch, or they leave very early in the day. So versus the farming communities where they don't start farming, or they start farming, they're near home, they're working near home, so they come back for this. So it has to do with just the way of life there. And this study was only done in Addis Ababa. We tried to get a representative sample of the types of houses. So there were some houses of professionals. There were some, quote, working class, unquote, houses, and there were some of the shanty type of houses. One of the things that I'm hoping to do is if I can get the logistics done, and working in Ethiopia, like in many developing countries, the logistics is very challenging. But that's one of the things I'm going to be working for in Gondar, is work there and then go into some of the rural areas in Gondar. Because the other difference is they use far more agricultural residues. So they'll use corn husks and wood and chaff and things like that. So there might be a different characteristic there too. Yes?
Are there any identifiable foundations or other systems that are working to improve sanitation? It's sort of a foundational issue for the World Health Organization. So how do they connect the dots? Or how should that? I realize I'm asking the question you don't want to answer, but
They should give me all the money and I'll arrange it. No, yeah, there's not a lot being done on a infrastructure programmatic level. It's just not being done. As you're aware, I know the fundings for priority is based not necessarily on the actual risk, but it's based on perception of risk and the glamorous sorts of things. So we were just, even talking at dinner that the certain foundations are happy to give millions of dollars to HIV education, sort of things, but they won't give that to sanitation systems or drinking water systems. So yeah, the connection between risk management, which is what we do to reduce risks, and the actual risk assessment, which is the science behind what the actual risks are. Risk assessment is just one input into that. There's politics, there's policy, there's social considerations, there's risk perception. So sadly, I'd say that there's really not a whole lot being done that I'm aware of at a systemic level in Ethiopia for sanitation, or even, well, I take that back. I did read that they are trying to expand the capacity of the southern well field system for the water. So. Yeah?
Just to clarify, did you mention something about the incense? You said most of the carbon monoxide?
No, I'm sorry. Most of the carbon monoxide is from the charcoal,
Okay.
and then the particles are about 50-50 from either of those, from the incense and from the charcoal. The charcoal looks cleaner burning, but if you can see the particles, it's not a small particle that's going to get deep in your lungs. So it's the small particles that you don't see from charcoal that are the respirable particles that will do that damage to the alveolar region. Anything else? Well, thank you again for coming, and appreciate your attention, and best of luck leading up to finals week and through finals.